you need is kill. Don't you be no shill. No, you don't have to swill, krill. All you need is kill. Singing intro is not back, but you get an obvious one for free. Anyway, hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And this past weekend, I went to see All You Need Is Kill, an anime adaptation of the 2004 light novel, basically a semi-illustrated novella of the same name, by Japanese author Hiroshi Sakurazaka and illustrator Yoshitoshi Abe. All You Need Is Kill had previously served as the inspiration for the 2014 Tom Cruise sci-fi star vehicle Edge of Tomorrow. But with the national release in Japan coming just a week ahead of its limited stateside rollout, All You Need Is Kill is now receiving the official animated treatment by none other than Studio 4C, an animation house that since its founding in the mid-90s has attracted considerable international attention for its cultivation of a body of work that consistently favors a combination of the sorts of wild and out sci-fi and fantasy stuff that tends to soak up most of the attention of national and international comic book cartoon aficionados alike, as well as the embracing of a more experimental and form-forward approach to designing, animating, and technically executing their productions. At least as far as here in the States, the most permeation that Studio 4C has gotten as far as distinguishing itself as that kind of more style-conscious, international boutique brand of still nonetheless fairly aggressively nerdy and dorky anime stuff. Their most well-known work within that context would probably still be The Animatrix, the direct-to-video animated anthology made to coincide with the release of the Matrix sequels. They produced 4 of the 9 shorts for that project, so nearly half the movie, and that's more likely than not the reason that even if you don't necessarily recognize a lot of Studio 4C titles, be they Masaaki Yuasa's Mind Games, or more recently the anime fantasy Hood movie, motherfuckers. Not sure how I feel about that one, but even if you don't recognize those titles, it might not be too long into the first minutes of All You Need Is Kill that you start to recognize not only that through all the boundary pushing over the years, that nonetheless evident Studio 4C house style, but also the studio's overall imprint on more boutique, more alternative, more cult cinephile-oriented animated stuff. You know, that kind of gives some folks a permission structure to enjoy wild Japanese fantasy stuff without being perceived as a white otaku. And that's not even necessarily to say that Studio 4C is the type of hip anime that you recommend to a prejudiced individual, somebody who just can't get into Japanese animation. If anything, that's kind of exemplary of their ignominy. On the one hand, the studio's productions consistently push the boundaries of what an international observer might register or recognize as anime, or at least anime in the sense of how it's bounded in our imaginations by so many repetitions of stereotypical images of roided out aliens and school children with the proportions of Dolly Parton, or just so many variations of so many kinds of stock faces and poses. Here, let me try some actually. I can't make blood rocket out of my nose by... Actually, one second, let me see. Nah, nothing. I'm looking at Jade Cargill right now and nothing. But anyway, the point is, there's actually still going to be a lot of that stuff in your average Studio 4C production, too. They're kind of in that tight spot where they're so out there in terms of design consistently, or at least get more technically granular than most anime productions, even for feature films, ever bother to do, frankly. And that's certainly the case for All You Need Is Kill, but then once you get past the spectacularity of the surface, what you're left with in this case is still a fairly routine kind of sci-fi, fantasy, action, dark comic, not exclusively juvenile, but clearly teen to 20-something geared coming-of-age saga. In other words, the packaging looks super neat. Why do you think I skipped out on The Bone Temple to see this? I can't do 2 January horror movies in a row, especially if they're both zombie movies. I can't do 2 January zombie movies. If I wanted to do that, I'd have bitten the bullet and gone out to the Highway Theater this past Friday and see The Crazies. The packaging looks super neat, but All You Need Is Kill turned out to be pretty predictable. It's a time loop story, like Edge of Tomorrow. You start off with the cataclysmic arrival of a strange, colossal alien organism that roots down on an Earth already hyper-advanced, future Earth. That's convenient. Our protagonist is a teenage runaway named Rita, who's taken a job as part of some kind of combined United Earth military, scientific, and resource extraction team. Basically, they get in these big mechanical exosuits and cut the exposed ground roots of the alien like a lumberyard. A year to the day that this alien, dubbed Daryl by the humans, a year to the day that it touches down, it starts spawning these alien drones called mimics that immediately begin an apocalyptic ravaging of the Earth, starting with Rita and her team as the first unhappy victims to the slaughter and the carnage. Some rather gnarly stuff following a nice, drawn-out, more atmospheric, slow burn opening in which this production, under the direction of Kenichiro Akimoto with Yukinori Nakamura acting as a co-director, this being a debut for both of them, having previously worked primarily as visual effects, drawing, and storyboard artists. This is really where the Studio 4C team gets to show off the iconoclasm that they're known for, most especially and immediately to anybody who is familiar with the light novel or its earlier manga adaptation. Again, this is the first official animated adaptation of the book. Because it's not just that the design of the characters, the backgrounds, the props, it's not just license with narrative deviations, or that the production team has basically opted to not emulate Yoshitoshi Abe's illustrations or that previous manga, but it just strikes off on their own path with these character designs that are, per usual, pretty far out in terms of what the templates, what the formulas are to even just the visual realization of so many examples of Japanese popular illustration and animation in fantasy genres, especially when concerning or aimed at older teenager and earlier adult readers and audiences. It's also that there are considerably more frames to the animation than is typical even for a top-line anime fantasy release. That gives the movement a far more lifelike sense and feel, with more minor details in facial expressions and physical movements. I would not be surprised if a considerable amount of rotoscoping, or at least guiding from pre-visualized models and actors performing for animators, was used to get some of the shots in this film before there is any action to speak of. The combination of traditional cell and CGI animation is more obvious in terms of attempting to immerse the spectator in this fantasy world. But at the same time, the design of All You Need Is Kill maintains a deliberate roughness. You will, in one sense, have this character of Rita, who is very much designed against type for an anime heroine, not only in terms of how her head is much bigger, her hair much bigger and unkempt, not slick. The tapering of her thin chin is more extreme because of how big her head is, but also her eyes are being drawn so narrowly. She also doesn't dress in a way that accentuates her body gratuitously. No real fan service to speak of, happy to say. Not easy to say about a lot of teenage girl characters in animation. That's all I'm gonna say. And you will notice at first that this character, with her distinctive, sympathetic, but nonetheless atypical design, she'll be moving about, and you'll sometimes even get POV shots from her that maintain a remarkable fidelity to what we might imagine it would look like to see just a person performing that action for a video or film recording. But the lines of her face, the lines following the contours of her design, they won't be perfectly clean lines. You'll still see the kind of indexicality of a drawing stroke, whereas everything from background to foreground elements, even if within a shot it will be realized, will be animated in such a way as to give it its own fidelity to a three-dimensional object. It'll still have this painterly quality at the surface, and this is exemplified in the monster, the kaiju kaiju, honestly, Daryl itself, so that when we get closer and closer to it, suddenly the thin line between the sort of psychological realism of the animation clashes with the deliberate roughness, the indexicality of an artist having to draw and paint that environment. It fits because then Rita is killed by one of the tree spawn, the mimics. They're called the same things in Edge of Tomorrow. She discovers she's in some kind of permanent loop where every time she dies, she starts that day over again. She has to fight her way out of the loop, and in a manner that is even explicitly conflated in the movie, as within the novel, apparently, as being like a video game. And as the film goes on, All You Need Is Kill makes good on that suggestion as a formula for watching Rita's progressive rise to the occasion as an anime fantasy heroine, although I will say that really only describes about 2/3 of the movie at its dramatic core. The climax really becomes its own strange odyssey unto itself, and it's there that you really start seeing the form-forward house style of Studio 4C flex its best attributes, of really taking that line between realism and artificiality to a definite extreme in just this collage of light and shape and color all clashing together as it's almost rattling any pretense of a tangible foundation anyway. While I haven't personally read either the original light novel or the manga, it's clear that the screenwriter has made so many deviations from the original text that it is now ironically the English language blockbuster take on the book that is now the more faithful adaptation of the book. Rita is not the protagonist of the book. In fact, her role has been rotated forward by the filmmakers, and by making the characters not soldiers, by just making them adrift blue-collar stiffs, it certainly seems like the objective there was to tone down that aspect of the book so that it's not any longer about some apocalyptic war between humanity and the mimics. And instead, with Rita rotated to the forefront of the story, it becomes more about what is at times even a rather poignant allegorical journey about finding a will to live, ironically, in a world, or at least a sense of time, of the past, the present, and the future that makes you want to just lay down and die. It's a coming-of-age depression and mental health story. Studio 4C didn't just copy anybody here. The production team went their own way, did their own thing, were inspired by fewer aspects of the light novel than one might suspect. Again, that sort of looseness of adaptation is not really typical for Japanese fantasy stuff. A lot of really cool stuff they did with this. It's really cool to look at. It kinda sucks, though. Like, I get it, this is more of a psychological character piece in the body of another bespoke action fantasy, but even as someone who's not the biggest anime head, at least not since I just exhausted myself cannibalizing Shonen Jump graphic novels in middle school, like those OG Naruto and Rurouni Kenshin prints, that was my shit back in the day. Loved me some Rurouni Kenshin. I have had enough anime and manga people in my ear that I can kind of surmise that, like, even that is not that big a deal, the whole allegorical character and political piece thing. At least that's what everyone would have me thinking Attack on Titan was about. I thought it was about giant naked zombies or something. So All You Need Is Kill, going into it, is honestly going to be less like an animated Edge of Tomorrow and more like, I might even compare it to, like, Inside Out. Like, literally almost like Inside Out meets Starship Troopers. But I just think in that regard, they gave themselves way too much license to fudge us around with the subtext here, because, let's be real, all that form-forward thinking, everything it does to draw us in, it's going to immediately repel us just as hard when we figure out that you got a little allegorical and painterly when you should have been tighter and aimed for as much indexicality in the writing as you did in how this Scott Pilgrim for depressed people would look. There's two major plot holes in this that are so big you could drive a fleet of warships through them, one of which is the classic one that, even if we allow for some sci-fi exosuit bullshit, even if, or even especially if the film then goes on to dramatically undermine the video game reading, or at least to complicate it dramatically. The difference between video games as challenges of skill and dying and coming back the same every day is that that's not just skill-based. I don't care how much your exosuit increases your strength and agility, your body does not build muscle over time if you're literally just particle reverting to your former self before you even ate a balanced breakfast. And estranged emo girls never eat balanced breakfasts. Same thing with the tech. These guys just got way too cocky, just trying to constantly pound on the up the ante button in how these action sequences escalate, or rather how the montages of many lives worth of actions escalates. And they completely forget that it boils down to the same thing. I'm sorry, you don't have any more time at the beginning of this day than you did yesterday because it's the same day. And okay, you give in the tidbit about small things changing because the mimics adapt. But inevitably, all you need is kill ends up locked in this paradox that isn't just about realism, it's undermining our sense of character or what even the dramatic point is supposed to be. Because those exosuits keep getting bigger and bigger, the fights keep getting more and more dramatic, and even if everyone is feudal, it means that every time these characters could have gone bigger, played it safer, and spared themselves a lot of new mornings, they just decided not to, I guess, because they're still learning how to use this technology over time. But again, is one of them just such a genius autodidact that he can just equip a fleet of drones to fight alongside? It doesn't take any more time to get all this shit together because they are always starting back at square one in terms of materials. All you need is kill just doesn't make sense at the end of the day, and there's really no finer point to put on it other than to say it's, again, always compelling and mysterious to look at, which is not so much that it doesn't have flatteringly original qualities, it's just that so many of them seem to exclusively be in dialogue with the book as an adaptation that it doesn't make any difference. So it's just, yeah, a broad action fantasy coming-of-age anime, except this more stylized one is just definitionally, objectively far beneath acceptable tightness and conception and writing. Like, again, I'm not even a huge anime guy, but just at random I started watching the original Mobile Suit Gundam series from 1979, and I gotta say, it's pretty tight. I didn't realize that what had happened was they were making a 43-episode commercial for colorful toy robots, and the people actually writing it decided they wanted to make it about child soldiers in some kind of total war scenario. It's an incredibly rudimentary production for the time from just an animation and technique perspective. But Mobile Suit Gundam, while it's so tailored to exactly the sort of consumerist trends that a much more deliberate and stylized production like All You Need Is Kill in 2026 would seem to eschew, I don't know, maybe boundary pushing and experimentation is sometimes just nice ad copy, but you gotta tighten up your writing, and at a certain point, you gotta humble yourself before those works that push boundaries, that cause stirs, that influence future creations, that are even prescient of new modes and styles and themes and formulas we can't really perceive yet, and do so with quiet confidence. I'm giving All You Need Is Kill a 3 out of 5. It's fine. I liked watching it way more than really thinking terribly highly of it as a work of anime art. Anyway, I'm rocketing from this tomb. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.